All right, now this is kind of a patched together case study from my work with traumatised men seeking asylum at Baptcare Sanctuary. I worked there for nearly 2 years. Wasn't quite enough for me. I would have preferred to stay on for a while, but in another sense, others told me, well, it probably was about enough, because working constantly with people who are living with complex post-traumatic stress disorders can create what they call vicarious trauma in those who are doing the listening and the caring. When you're being exposed day after day after day after day, not just to the stories of trauma, not even to the stories of trauma, it's not even necessary to hear the stories, but to the behaviours that manifest through interaction with traumatised people, then that can begin to trigger traumatic responses in yourself. So you suffer from vicarious trauma. So it's probably a good thing that I moved on. But so I'm going to tell a bit of a story, and if you we're going to make this up as we go along, in a sense. So if there's an element of trauma or abuse that you think might be helpful to the case study, throw it in, and we'll just pop it into the mix. We'll probably end up with a randomly complex human being that might not ever exist, but that's okay. So let's call this person who? Chris Turner. Let's call... I'm just trying to think of a gender-neutral name. What's a good gender-neutral name? Chris. Okay. All right. Okay. So Chris. Okay. Chris's country of origin is engaged in civil war. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And the civil war is between two ethnic groups of slightly different religious persuasion. Doesn't matter what they are. Okay, so you've got two ethnic groups. I actually don't like the word ethnic. What's another word that we could use? Two people groups. Distinguished by religion. Okay, so that's the country of origin. This pen's going to give way. And that's related to that. Okay. When Chris was 20, he was arrested and accused of working for the opposing group to those who arrested him. He was imprisoned for 60 days and tortured. The torture involved breaking both of his legs and hanging him by a rope from the ceiling for days on end. So 2 broken legs. And hanging. He was from that prison. He was then sent to a re-education camp. Oops. was he used to lie awake at night. That they would leave the lights on all night, and the rats and mice and stuff would crawl over him, and and he was just a young man, so it was quite a terrifying experience. And then he was eventually emasculated before being released back into the community. So physically emasculated, I'll just say physically abused. By this time he was manifesting PTSD. And which included panic attacks, anxiety, dissociation. You know what dissociation is? All of those things.
Was there anger?
Possibly, but he doesn't necessarily express it in classic ways of. So rather than get really, really angry, he dissociates into another personality. It's usually a younger version of himself, or it's a member of his family, or a friend, or something like that that he dissociates to. Yeah. After he's released back into the community, he takes a boat from his country of origin to what's commonly termed these days a sort of transit country, a country where there's no system of seeking asylum, but you can kind of go there and disappear for a time. So I'll just say he's in transit for 5 years, where he does all kinds of work for cash, saves up enough money, eventually buys his way onto a boat for Australia. Lands in Australia, is detained and put into detention, and his claim for asylum is there processed, and he's given a one of those temporary visas where you just are released into the community.
Not allowed to work.
He's not allowed to work. He's not allowed
to volunteer.
He's allowed to volunteer, but he's not allowed to be paid for any work. He is not allowed to go to school or university at all.
Doesn't have a Centrelink card.
He has a particular kind of Medicare card, but it's not the same kind of Medicare card as everyone else. He gets about 80% of New Start, and is told, "We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you." So you read the chapter about ambiguous trauma, Pauline Boss. At the moment, in this scenario, he's now living in Australia, but stateless. Okay, so his trauma is ongoing. So in that sense, we could say, we'll get rid of the P. He's living with traumatic stress disorders, ongoing, ambiguous. Yeah. He spends approximately, what shall I say, about 4 months of every year in the psychiatric ward, the acute psychiatric ward of Northern Hospital. He has about 10 therapists that work with him. He's got a psychologist, he's got a counsellor, he's got a trauma torture counsellor with Foundation House. He has a youth worker, a community worker, a GP, psychologist. Did I say psychologist? I did start. I'm trying to think of someone else. Psychiatrist, sorry, yeah, for the medication. Yeah, so, and most of his week is taken up by visiting these different therapists.
Support group?
So,
Any support group?
in terms of an organised community support group, do you mean?
Or an informal?
No, he's living in let's say he's living in Sanctuary, the facility, so he gets support there from the staff. The food they eat is mostly donated food. But he's living in a context where there are 40 other male unaccompanied asylum seekers who all have stories not dissimilar to his own. Perhaps some of them, not all of them quite as severe as this, but many of them not far off it. He's a lovely, quietly spoken man. Friendly. One day you'd think he was just the most socially well-adjusted person in the world. The next day he's in the fetal position in his room, can't move, doesn't know who you are, doesn't know who he is. And he's never quite sure when he's going to dissociate. Can't sleep most of the night. Certain things trigger panic attacks for him. His original arrest, has imprinted in his amygdala an immediate freeze response to anyone wearing a two-way radio. Go figure that one out. You know, it wasn't the gun, it wasn't the uniform or whatever. It was the two-way radio that somehow holds the trauma for him. How are you going to listen to this person? That was my response when I first turned up too. Stunned silence.
Does he want to engage?
When you first encounter him, he's one of the few people in the centre who will actually come to your door and say, "Hi, how are you? Is there anything I can do to help you?" Or, you know.
I was going to say, is that a sense of responsibility?
There is.
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
I'm not sure, it just was apparent.
Yeah. So you would say he lives with a kind of daily sense of responsibility.
Outward, yeah.
Civility for others.
Yeah.
We might say, as my partner says, an overextended sense of personal responsibility, which is a fairly common condition amongst normal, any human being.
Yeah.
Not that this person's not normal. I'm not saying he's not normal at all. He's perfectly normal. And that's actually a good point. First up, when we approach a person like this, it's tempting, like I just did, to differentiate them from normal people. If you had experienced this and you had this kind of response, you would be being perfectly normal. There is nothing abnormal about this. So in that sense, the language of disorders is problematic at times because it suggests that in fact something is wrong. In fact, dissociation is a perfectly healthy coping response to intolerable trauma like this. So one of our first ways of approaching as spiritual carers this kind of situation is to listen to ourselves and our own response to the person and do the hard work that needs to be done to remind ourselves that we are with a perfectly normal, fully human person. And, particularly in institutions, it's really hard when you're employed by the institution and the other person is the subject of, client of the institution, it's actually hard to get out of that kind of relationship where you're the powerful helper and they're the weak client, recipient of care. So perhaps the first point of listening is to establish mutual regard. Now, mutual means two-way, and I can't force him to regard me as his mutual equal, can I? So what do I need to build? There you go, there's your clue. In order to facilitate mutuality. Trust. Yeah. Now, I would suggest that building trust has a lot to do with authenticity. And authenticity comes when we are genuine. We're actually there because we actually do think this person is our equal, not because we're employing that as one of our therapeutic tools out of our toolbox. Oh, okay, step one, establish mutual.
Build rapport.
Yeah, build rapport. People like this see through that stuff.
Or use it.
Right. Or use it to manipulate you. Yeah. Yeah. I'll use a swear word. Oh no, maybe I should. No, I'm being filmed. People's BS radars are really, really sensitive when this stuff's happening. They can see through you a mile away if you are not authentic, if you're not there because you actually really give a about this. So yeah, we're not building trust as a strategy. We're actually genuinely offering ourselves as a trustworthy companion in this space. And it may feel weird, but in this case, differentiating yourself from the flock of therapists was crucial in building this. The mutuality came by the very fact that you did not presume to enter the fray as one of the pack who were trying to fix him. Yeah. What else?
Probably like listening and looking at his body responses would be really important so that you can see the warning signs of when he might be having a panic attack or dissociation.
Yeah, absolutely. So paying attention to the whole person. So Chris would on some days be really bright and sociable, and then on other days he wouldn't appear at all. You know, now that's okay; it's his prerogative. He doesn't have to come out and socialise if he doesn't want to. If he didn't appear for 2 or 3 days in a row, it was part of my stated job description to just go and knock on his door and say, "Hey mate, you okay?" You know. Or it may be that I just see him wandering past in the corridor and I notice that his head's down, that he's hunched in, that he's more apologetic than usual, or that he's, you know, but I'm doing what we did here. I'm dancing with him, you know. It's like, where are you at, mate? You know, and not to the point where I'm being intrusive, because he's my equal, and I don't like people, you know, analysing my every movement. But to the point just where I'm paying attention, as any friend would.
From my experience, be with the prisoners, what I usually do is just stay with them. I don't talk much.
Yeah.
Once just stay, sit down with them.
So this is with prisoners.
Yeah.
What type of prisoners are you working with generally, James?
All type of the
All
prisoners,
kinds.
all
Okay.
kinds of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So their experiences would be varied, but would usually involve some form of abusive
Yes.
history and ongoing trauma in that sense.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. So your first is that your first step to be present
Yeah.
in that sense?
Just be
Yep.
present with
Yep.
them.
Yeah. So be present. Yep.
Maybe without an agenda or an outcome in mind.
Yep. Now, this is really important. Being present without an agenda or an outcome actually opens up your capacity as a carer. Because just as you were watching each other carefully here, as we were watching each other carefully in here, if you're paying attention, you will be ready and open to respond to the other in a way that they will invite you to participate. So if I've got a rigid view of myself as a listener, as the therapist sitting in my office receiving people, I'll put you in my calendar, mate, I'll see you at 10 and I'll see you at 11 and then I'll have my lunch break and then I'll do 3 sessions after lunch. And if that's my rigid understanding of what spiritual care is, I've kind of got my own rigid agenda, haven't I? And they're having to fit in to that with me.
I fully agree with that thing. When I visit them, I cannot fix time. Just
You
different
can't fix
people-
time. Yeah,
time.
right.
Different people need different span of time.
Yep,
Some maybe 5 minutes, some maybe an hour.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's right. And you can do great spiritual care in 5 minutes
Yes.
and great spiritual care in 3 hours. And you've got to protect yourself, of course. 3 hours is a long time for anyone. But, for example, Chris would often say, I'm going for a walk. Do you want to come? Now, I could be sitting at my desk going, I've got to do my stats, going for a walk, what a waste of time. But if I'm present to Chris without my agenda, I can recognise that actually walking is an alternative to dissociating. Because when he's anxious, he feels like he can't move. And so walking, deciding to go for a walk, is saying, I'm going to give my body a chance to tell my brain that I can move. And so as a spiritual carer, I say, yes, I go for a walk with you. And you go and you talk about footy, or you talk about what a pain in the neck the government is, or as you walk, you divulge yourself. It's so much easier just to let your brain, your story, allow itself to express while your body is moving. So Chris and Chris would go for long walks, an hour and a half, and that was recognised by my boss as spiritual care. So I could put that in my statistics. Say, that's a valid spiritual care intervention. I don't like the word of intervention. That's the words that some organisations use, but it was a form of listening, and not just to his story. In fact, I didn't hear Chris's story until I'd known him for 8 months. I didn't actually know his backstory, because I had determined that listening in these situations is about being present without agenda or outcome. It actually didn't matter whether I knew his story or not, because what was important was this whole complex human being who was in front of me right now. So what is his lived experience right now? That's what we're listening for. Now, that stuff builds this and this. We used to do sorry, come.
Just a clarification. Some of them, like they to calm down, they like to have a cigarette or
Yep.
like a cup of
Yeah.
tea or coffee or something, or drink something.
Yeah,
Is it a good idea to give them company? Because
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. If that's what they want, smoking a cigarette as a coping mechanism is a pretty low impact result of this kind of trauma. You might not think smoking's the best thing in the world, but frankly, who cares? go and stand outside with them and, you know, take your cuppa and, yeah, because that might be a space within which they are relaxing and, as you say, they're giving themselves space. So I went to visit Chris once in the psych ward. I went to visit him many times, but on this particular occasion I went and he was in the middle of an assessment with the psychiatrist, so I couldn't see him straight away. So I just walked out into the garden, sort of blank bit of grass out the back, and sat down. And within 5 minutes, I had 3 strangers sitting around me, having their cigarettes, just asking me in gentle voices, you know, "How you going, mate? Are you here to visit someone?" And, you know, and just chatting. Normal human interaction. It's extraordinary how many people living with trauma are gentle, quiet people who are fragile in the world, you know. And if you are able to be still with them and be present and to be with them in whatever mode of being they need to be in at that particular time, without being alarmed and judgmental or panicked yourself, then their vulnerable, reticent selves begin to emerge, and they can tell who's trustworthy.
We do Christmas carols around the hospital every year, and we went down to the mental health ward, and there's this understanding that you're meant to sing jolly ho 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 kind of Christmas carols.
Yeah.
Go to mental health ward, you know, cheer people up.
Yeah, keep it all nice and happy.
Cheer people
Yeah.
We sang, I can't remember what it was that we sang, but we sang one of the really quiet, gentle, melodic Christmas carols. And there was a girl there who just came and sat in front of us, cross-legged, like that. And she just listened.
Yep.
She just listened. And when we got to the end of that song, she just said, and got up and walked away.
Yeah.
It was that she connected to the gentleness of the melody and, you know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a craving for that.
Absolutely there is. Yeah.
Because they've known the opposite.
Yep. Any kind of experience that reminds the traumatised person or the abused person of a time when they existed without trauma or abuse enables their brain to begin the recreation of a new neural pathway and the adjustment of the kinds of chemicals that are secreted into the system. So, for example, one of the first group things I did for the folks at Sanctuary was to organise a snow trip. And I just thought, let's just go to the snow, you know, like go up to Lake Mountain. I ended up with a bus full of various different types of people, some who had, of course, come from the mountains of, you know, northern Iraq and Iran and so on, where there was plenty of snow. And they just hadn't seen it for 5 years or whatever in their travels. And so they were just like, yeah, let's go to the snow, you know. There were others on the bus who'd never seen snow in their entire lives. And I'll never forget when we first started driving up, we just went up to Lake Mountain, and we got to those first bits of snow, and it was a fantastic day. It just bucketed snow all day. It was just, couldn't have asked for a better day. And this little guy up the back, it was just pressed up against the glass, and he just spontaneously said, "Chris, this is amazing. I never want to leave this place." You know, he hadn't actually been out in it yet. You know, it was, you know, that amazing sort of sense of, oh, snow's amazing. Then you get out and it was like, hey, it's cold and it's wet. And, you know, for that, and then for the rest of the day we did tobogganing, we threw snow at each other. We just, you know, and there were guys who would there was one guy who just sat down in the snow and just went into this kind of meditative zone for most of the time we were there. He just sat there soaking it all up. And of course there was the whole process of putting chains on the bus and taking the chains off the bus, and the guys would all get off and help out and do that sort of stuff. And it wasn't, apart from me being the organiser and always feeling a little bit anxious about everything, as you are when you're organising something, but for the rest of it, we were pretty much able to just relax into the whole thing and just let it be a bunch of mates out in the snow together, you know. And so there was no sense in which I was doing stuff for them. You know, they were the ones putting the chains on and taking the chains off. They were the ones organising the lunch and the, you know, all that sort of stuff. We were just a bunch of mates out in the snow. You know, last week we talked about the spiritual dynamics of trauma and abuse, how your sense of agency is diminished by the abusing suppression of your freedom by another person. These kinds of activities enable people to re-experience agency and freedom. And that's the stuff that tackles the trauma, tackles the abuse. It's a kind of visceral remembering. Because you can't remember it up here, because the trauma story just gets... I had guys often talk to me saying, you know, I'd be fine, Chris, if I could just switch off the radio up here. Because it was just on a loop, a trauma loop, constantly. This Chris used to, when this was going on, and he had like 5 or 6 voices chattering away in his head at the same time, he would often, you know, do the thing, and I never knew what, until I turned up here, I never actually knew what was going on there. And he taught me. Like I said to him, Chris, what are you doing? You know, I decided I was just going to treat him normally and not sort of, you know, condescend. Oh, are you okay? And so I just said, what are you doing? You're hitting yourself on the head. That's a bit, you know, it's a bit self-abusive, isn't it? And he goes, no, mate, I'm just trying to reset the radio. You know, the way we always used to. Bang the side of the radio to get the thing on tune. He was just trying to do the same thing with his head. It was perfectly rational behaviour. We would all do the same. So Chris taught me a lot about the kinds of behaviours that seem really antisocial, and in fact are antisocial. They reduced his capacity to relate to people enormously. His sphere of relationships was very small because he was just weird, you know. But if you're able to attend to some of this stuff, you get underneath the weirdness and you realise that there's a perfectly rational, surviving human person here. Now, none of this necessarily leads to a nice, neat, therapeutic, healing outcome. And that's why I wanted you to read Pauline Boss's article on ambiguous trauma, ambiguous loss and trauma, because what she explores in that book, in her book, is the idea that some kinds of trauma are not resolvable. So it's not a matter of fixing the trauma or fixing the abuse. One could argue, in fact, why would you want to try and make someone's experience of abuse disappear? Because it has defined, to some extent, how they've developed as a human person. And to try and pretend that you can just make it disappear would be doing a disservice to the experience of the person. So there's a justice element. So we're actually not trying to fix in this sense. And if we can somehow let go of the desire to fix, which is actually a person who's not fixable, is a challenge to our sense of agency, because our sense of the capacity to impact those around us relies on those around us being impactable. Do you know what I mean? And if, as in fact every human person is, if we listen carefully enough, if the other person is not responsive to my attempts to fix them or to heal them or to take them successfully through a program of therapy, what does that mean about my capacity as a carer? Does it mean I'm a failure? And that's what I'm afraid of. So part of listening in the presence of abuse and trauma is the acceptance of the listener that you will not necessarily heal this person, nor is it your role to. Healing may come, but if it comes, it'll be Chris who does it, not you. Your role is to companion, to break bread with Chris as a mutual, fully established human person, even in the midst of his broken trauma. He's still a full human being. And witness what happens when two human beings can recognise one another in this context. It's extraordinary. It's not therapy, it's a miracle. It's a miracle in the sense that it's not some kind of supernatural intervention. It's a miracle because something happens greater than the sum of the parts. When you put presence, listening, attentive presence, together with unutterably complex trauma, you don't necessarily expect to get, equals healing. Because you let go of that equation here. But invariably what happens is something beyond what you could ever imagine as healing. You might not get a perfectly well-adjusted socialite, but you will get a human being that exists in a way that is an extraordinary impact on the rest of society. And we don't want little clones, do we? We don't want everyone to turn out the same way as nice little products of our great therapy systems. We want human beings who've had experiences and who are living in response to them, living resilient human beings. I think I told you earlier on in the semester about the guy whose father was summarily executed in front of him when he was 14. He said to me, "Why would I want to forget that? It's both the source of my disorder and it's also the foundation of my living for the rest of my life, because that was my father, and I will never forget him or give up my memory of him just because I want to live a nice, easy life." That was his thing. So he was determined to live in and through his trauma.
Does it mean it's a healthy trauma by accepting that, but it's still a living trauma?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Can trauma be a healthy thing? Because there's a sense in which what I'm saying might suggest that.
It's part of life. It's like saying, can hunger be a healthy thing?
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah. Well, if you never got hungry, you'd be in strife, I guess. You might forget to eat.
Yeah. And if you're so hungry that you're unlikely to see tomorrow morning, then it's not a healthy thing.
Yeah.
If your trauma stops you from being able to live the life that you would choose to live, that's a different thing to someone whose trauma informs their capacity to see other people.
Yeah, so remember our parameters, our homeostatic parameters. Everything out here is death. Everything in here is the conditions necessary for life.
Yeah.
If trauma pushes us out here, then it's a profound threat. Most times when we experience a trauma, we're pushed to our outer limits, and our resilient and our natural homeostatic responses that we call resilience, the adjustments that take place in us, turn us around at this point, and we come back in here. Post-traumatic stress disorder pushes us outside. That's why we call it a disorder, because it pushes us out here. So if I am so, let's just say I'm dissociating most of the time, the chances of me holding down a good relationship so that I can have children are fairly slim, probably, or staying in my relationship with my children It's problematic, and that actually represents the pushing of a boundary in that sense. If we go back right to the basics of human survival and evolution, in order to breed as a species, we need to be able to interact socially. And if we are so busy running away from things, terrified all the time, that we can't interact, then we won't breed. It's as basic as that. And that's the way our brains have developed. Anything that pushes us in that sense manifests as what we call a disorder, because it threatens the conditions under which life is able to thrive. Most of the time, trauma doesn't push us outside the bed. Like I said, we bounce back, we adjust, we shift. We grow, yeah. What I used to often remind myself of when I was going into work about people like Chris was that it's extraordinary that he's still alive. You know, at any point in this story, you know, tortured, he could have died in the torture. He was, you know, hanging up by the ankles for 3 days from the roof of the torture chamber. He could have died. Physically abused in the re-education camp. He could have succumbed to any kind of infection and so on and died in here. He could have succumbed to suicidal ideation in here and taken his own life. He could have drowned on his way. This person represents extraordinary human resilience. Extraordinary.
So can he turn his trauma into a story to tell how you overcome?
Well, there may be a time at which he could. I don't think there is ever a time in which it is appropriate for a spiritual care practitioner to suggest, hey, you could give your testimony, or you could, you know, you could help a lot of people by telling your story. Because I think that's serving the interests of someone other than this person. But it may be, and it certainly has been the case, that people who reach a place of reconciliation with their own story feel that it's part of their offering of gratitude to the people around them and so on, or to God or whatever, to share their story and use it to help other people. And, you know, places like the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and so on are full of people who have been through these kind of experiences, who are now working like crazy to help other people who are going through those sorts of experiences. So yeah, it can build a sense of human solidarity, but it needs to come out of the agency of this person. I'll never forget, this is just a story from a completely different scenario, but when I was a young youth group leader at a church in the outer eastern suburbs here of Melbourne, a guy came to our youth group who was on a methadone program. He'd been a heroin addict for the last 3 years. He was only our age, so he would have been heroin since he was about 15. And he was on methadone, and he was your classic kind of drugged out hippie dude. He had long hair and he had pale skin, and he was skinny and scrawny, but he was making it. He was getting off the gear, you know. And he used to stand outside the church with his cigarette, you know, and he would feel judged by people. And I'll never forget, the minister, John, once came up to him and said, he goes, mate, he goes, you know, everyone else here is the same. They've all got their little vices. Yours is just more visible than theirs. Made him feel a lot better, you know. But one of the guys in the church decided that this young kid had a great story, and wouldn't it be great to get him up to give his testimony, so that, you know, because the story of rags to riches or conversion, you know, like, you know, drugs to Jesus or whatever, is such a great story to put up there on the pedestal at church. And I witnessed this person asking him to do that, and I didn't know what I was talking about, but I instinctively felt the violence in it. And so as soon as this other guy had left, I said to him, you don't have to do that. don't do it. Because I can feel it in that the reticence, the vulnerability of that person is extraordinary. So it's never up to us. We never use the situation unless we've been given permission. So any story that I tell from my time there is being told because I got permission direct from the person to share their story. And this is not one story anyway. This is a collection of different stories brought
And there's
together.
the other side too, which are the people that don't have the resilience.
Yeah,
There's that pressure that can be put on people to be the hero, to come through all this and aren't you amazing and so much. But what
Yep.
if they're not resilient?
right.
What if it has broken them?
Yeah.
What, you know? I mean, that's just as valid.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just as valid a reaction to what you've lived through.
And it's just as spiritual as the happy story. Remember we said earlier on, I can't remember where I said it, in this class or the other class, but we don't stop being spiritual just by virtue of the fact that we're struggling or we're going through a dark place or something. We can't talk about spiritual health being someone who's well adjusted spiritually. You know, whatever that is, well adjusted, you know, in line with their own sense of identity and values and beliefs or whatever you might want to describe it as. You know, the person who's on the brink of suicide is experiencing themselves spiritually as at that point where there is no other way out. That's a spirituality. That's a spiritual reality. And we need to recognise it as such. So our place is to be as present to that stuff as we are to the great stories that work out really, really well. I'll give you an example. Working for an organisation, of course, we are always taught rightly to understand and recognise suicidal ideation, so the presence of suicidal thoughts in a person's experience, and the steps to take to help them avoid actually taking their own life. And we were mandated to report up straight away and to remove any implements, and it was a regular thing at Sanctuary. There was one guy there who, just before I'd arrived to start working at Sanctuary, had actually just survived an attempt to take his own life. He tried to hang himself in his bedroom, and the previous spiritual carer had actually found him and sort of called someone, and they sort of got him down, and he survived. But he was an ongoing suicide watch. And it came to a point where he had heard that Border Force were coming for him. In fact, they turned up one day at the front door. It was a pretty horrific experience. And more power to my boss, who was actually a lawyer, told them to go away, which they did, surprisingly enough. But this guy got wind of the fact that they were after him, and he said, "I will take my own life before they take me in." And so all the alarm bells went off. The suicide watch, the suicide response was put into action, and I was asked to go and sit with him and listen to this stuff. Now, I'm in a position of conflict at that point, because I've got the organisation on one side saying you have to participate in the suicide response, suicide risk response, and on the other hand, I'm trying to be this to him. In order to be this to him, I can't have one finger on the red button. Now, I don't know how you would do this, but I did it by participating in the process, yeah, and then sort of flipping into a completely different process once I was on a one-to-one encounter situation with him. So I'd go into his space, and I wouldn't spend any time trying to take knives off him or any of that sort of stuff. I actually sat with him and I said, what are you experiencing right now? What's happening for you right now? And he said, if they come for me, I will kill myself. And I said, okay. Where's that coming from? What leads you to say that? And he said, he'd been a Tamil Tiger in Sri Lanka, and he said, what would you do? He said, if they take me into custody and put me on a plane and send me back to Sri Lanka, within a week I will be abducted by men driving a white van, and they will drive me out into the forest, and they will assassinate me and leave me in a ditch and drive away, and no one will know who they were or any of that. And I will have succumbed. I will have handed my life that I fought for. I fought for freedom. He understood himself to be a freedom fighter, not a terrorist. He was fighting for his people. He'd been a child soldier. He started when he was 15, and had at one point been responsible for keeping 100 men alive in the jungle as a fighting unit. Now, extraordinary stuff. I can't even imagine what it means to do that. He said, if I allow that to happen, I have allowed my enemy, my abuser, to determine the way my life ends. And I won't do it. He said, if I take my own life here while I'm free, I'm exercising my own freedom and agency to determine how I end my life, and I will do it as a free man with meaning and dignity. Is suicide wrong in that context? You'd be a brave person to say it was okay, because in an organisational context, it's never okay. But when you are confronted with an irreducibly complex human being, there are times when you have to acknowledge the lived experience of the person. For him, suicide represented freedom, agency, meaning, life. Arrest meant loss of freedom, re-perpetration of abuse, further trauma, loss of meaning, and death. So listening can be complex in this situation.
You could almost say that suicide was the spiritual option for him because of the meaning and the only hope, really.
Yep. Yeah, if we think of spirituality as the person who is questing after ultimate meaning, relationship, life, we know from what we heard in our first session that the opposite to life is not death, it's trauma. That's the way trauma specialists think about it. So, in actual fact, death at times can represent life, the fullness of life, the fullness of meaning. I mean, we allow people the agency to offer their own life for others. We certainly allow people to lay down their life for the sake of the state in warfare. We admire certain religious figures for laying down their lives for others and for, and so on. And so we need to allow ourselves to be challenged by the actual lived experience and listen to that. Now, I would never have facilitated this person's suicide. I took a knife off him the same day. And I invited him to consider those other aspects of his life that it might be worth keeping on living for. He had a relative back home who wasn't his own child, but someone who he felt was like a goddaughter, and he'd been sending money back to her for years, and for that was an element of hope for him. But if he had happened to have taken his own life, I would not have reported it to my superiors as a tragedy. I would have reported it as a decision in the interests of life and spirit and meaning.
A young man in the hospital just in this last week who had been on dialysis for some years and had diabetes and other comorbidities, and reached a point stand doing dialysis anymore
Mm.
for several different reasons. And he had the devil's own job convincing people that he was allowed to stop
Mm.
dialysis.
Mm.
He
Mm.
had all the psych teams, he had
Mm.
medical staff arguing with him, he had a hell of a time.
Yeah.
But for him, it was a freedom from what he was going through.
Yep. Yep.
With his illnesses and his
Yeah.
diagnosis.
And we hear it often, don't we? It's the young football player recently who decided to stop having chemotherapy in response to his leukemia.
Yeah.
The greatest enemy of life in that instance was not death.
No,
To die, in fact, was to live fully.
it was an end of trauma.
It was an end of trauma. Yeah. So it was the same for my dad, you know. He'd lived with trauma for 2 years, being fed through a tube through his nose. And when the prospect of having to do that again came along, he said, no, I'd rather die, thanks. Actually represents life for me, not, you know, the tube actually represents death.
Yeah.
Trauma and death, in a sense. Now, this actually raises a very pertinent current question that's just been before the National Parliament. What is the meaning of euthanasia? And this conversation is not going to go away from us, despite the fact that Parliament... it's because our understandings of what is life are shifting and moving, because we're becoming more attentive, in a sense. You know. Now, the case for euthanasia has a strong case to answer against its critics. But you can see why there are those arguing for it.
And in countries where they have passed laws for euthanasia, what they found is that it actually happens very rarely because people apply for euthanasia, and the process that they have to go through, in that process they get heard.
Yep.
And all the things that were making life unbearable for them mostly get resolved, and they don't feel the need to euthanize anymore.
Now, isn't that an extraordinary statement? Because what you just said was, the process facilitated some of this stuff,
Yeah,
and the miracle happened.
yeah.
Yeah?
Their pain got taken care of.
Right.
Or their family rallied around and you know, the conflict was resolved, or whatever it was that was making their life
Yeah.
unbearable.
Yeah.
They got hurt.
Mm. Yep. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Yeah. Beautiful. Mm.
David Augsburger says that listening, paraphrase, listening is up there with love.
Yeah.
It's the closest thing to being loved.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Paul Tillich says something very similar. Yeah. Love listens, he says. Yeah. Love listens. Yeah. Yeah. And he goes on to say that there is a part of every human person crying out for justice. And the cry for justice is, will someone pay attention to my situation? Will someone hear me, please? And he says, love listens. Love listens. Yeah.
Chris, I had a rather interesting situation.
Yeah.
I was visiting the hospital where mental patients are put there.
Yeah.
And I went to visit a patient. And there was this girl, no? She was around 20 years old. She was just walking around, and she comes and look at me and smile.
Yeah.
And then she came second time and she said, are you married? She asked me. I said, no, I'm not married. And then she came back third time and she said, will you love me? I said, I did not say anything.
Yeah.
So the third time she came and told, will you marry me? In this situation, what, we just ignore it or just say, they are trying to say something.
Yeah.
So,
Um, my answer to that is uphold the person's dignity. Yeah. There's a reason why she's asking you to marry her, even though she's never met you in her life before. you know. And the reasons can range from all kinds of mental illness, which don't occur in a void, mind you. They are responses to human experience. All the way through to any number of complex, perfectly explainable needs and desires in her. What would my response be, I wonder? I think initially I would want to recognise, try and show some generosity around the recognition of what an incredible compliment that is. Potentially, you know, that someone would do you that, would offer you that dignity. Whether it's misplaced or comes from a dysfunctional place in them or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's been expressed and they've put themselves in an incredibly vulnerable situation.
I'd ask them, what's with getting married? Why do you think that'd be a good idea?
Yeah, right. And then taking it back to their own experience. So where does that
Where's
question
that
come from in you? Yeah. Why do you ask me that? Yeah. Thank you, by the way, but why do you ask? You know? I think always undergirding, responding to a person as if they are your equal. Because they are. Just because a person is more vulnerable than we are doesn't make them less than we are. In fact, vulnerability actually, you might argue, can actually establish a human person with rich depth and breadth and so on. Yeah. Yeah, human beings can throw up some curly ones for us, that's for sure. And maintaining our own dignity and theirs in the way we respond is really, really important.
I just told her I will think about it.
Yeah, great. Well, there you go. There's a perfectly normal human response, you know. Yeah, thanks. All right, I'll have a think about that. Yeah. Yeah, but certainly not shaming people in those situations, which I know you would never do anyway. But it's it is easy for us to laugh at people who do odd social things. But you know, one day we're going to be in a vulnerable situation where we're subject to the capacity of others more powerful than us to either dignify us or shame us.
My girlfriend's mother, when she went through menopause, was a pre-menopause. She was a pillar of the community. She was a gentle, knitting nana kind of a person, you know. And she went through menopause and she got arrested for beating someone up in the phone box with her umbrella because they wouldn't get off the phone.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That was not her.
No.
That was her on the day.
Mm.
That was her with her menopausal hormones in full flight.
Yeah. Yep.
And to be shamed for that, she would never recover from being shamed for that. So you never know why people are, you know, you could assume that she was someone who had a violent temper and or was mad or fundamentally flawed, or you know, but in actual fact she just had a health condition that had gotten out of control.
And this is where Carl Rogers' focus on unconditional positive regard is important, because we regard the human person and we recognise them as limited by all kinds of circumstances. We don't justify their behaviour. We hold ourselves and others responsible for our behaviour, but we don't demean and diminish and shame one another, because one day we're going to be the ones that beat someone up with our umbrella and, you know, wonder why the hell we just did that, you know. Like,